The day began like any other at the international airport, with streams of passengers rushing to catch flights that would carry them to all corners of the globe. The waiting lounges buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the quiet rustle of people scrolling on their phones. Among them was a woman who stood out without even trying. She was dressed in a simple navy suit, her hair neat, and her face calm and poised. She carried no designer handbag, no loud jewelry, nothing flashy to tell the world who she really was. To most people around her, she seemed like an ordinary traveler, someone heading to a business meeting or perhaps a family event. But this woman was far from ordinary. She was one of the youngest billionaires in the world, a woman who had built her empire through sharp thinking, fearless investments, and an unshakable belief in herself. Yet she had learned long ago that wealth didn't always protect you from prejudice or disrespect. Today, she was about to be reminded of that lesson in a way she hadn't expected. When her boarding group was called, she rose gracefully and walked toward the gate. Her ticket was scanned, and she stepped onto the jet bridge with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Inside the aircraft, a flight attendant greeted her with a quick glance. There was no warm smile, no polite welcome aboard. Instead, there was a frown, followed by a whisper to a colleague. The billionaire didn't miss the way their eyes rolled as they looked her up and down. Still, she said nothing. She believed in letting actions speak louder than words. She found her seat in business class, placed her carry-on neatly in the overhead bin, and sat down. Around her, other passengers settled in, pulling out tablets, newspapers, or simply closing their eyes to rest before takeoff. Minutes later, as the doors were closed and the final checks were underway, the captain himself walked through the aisle. He was a tall man in his uniform, his steps heavy with authority. Some passengers smiled at him, clearly impressed to see the one in command of the aircraft walking among them. But when his eyes fell on the billionaire, his expression hardened. He stopped, glanced at the flight attendant, and then leaned closer to the woman. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" he asked loudly enough for others nearby to hear. The billionaire raised her eyes to him, her voice calm. "Yes, this is my seat." The pilot chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You must have made a mistake. These seats aren't cheap, you know. Maybe you belong back there." He jerked his thumb toward the economy section. Gasps came from a few nearby passengers, but most stayed silent, unsure whether to intervene. The billionaire sat still, her eyes steady on the man towering over her. "I assure you," she replied, her voice steady as stone, "this is my seat." The flight attendant stepped forward then, her tone sharp. "Sir," maybe she doesn't understand. Some people try to sneak into seats they haven't paid for. We should check her ticket again. Without hesitation, the woman handed over her boarding pass. The attendant snatched it, her lips curling into a smirk as she read the clearly printed seat number. The smirk quickly faded, but instead of apologizing, she thrust the ticket back into the billionaire's hand and muttered, "Fine, stay here if you insist." The billionaire held her composure, though inside she felt the sting of their words. She had dealt with dismissive people before, but on this day, on this flight, the arrogance seemed sharper, bolder, and more public. She knew every eye around her was watching, waiting to see how she would respond. But she remained silent. Moments later, as the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension escalated further. The pilot returned, his face red with irritation. "Listen," he snapped, leaning closer until his voice boomed over the hum of the engines. "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't tolerate liars or troublemakers on my plane." Before the billionaire could even reply, the flight attendant placed a hand on her shoulder, shoving her slightly as if to force her up. The woman's body tensed. A wave of disbelief swept through the cabin. Some passengers gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man started recording on his phone, sensing that this moment was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The billionaire's eyes closed for a brief moment, her lips pressing together. She wasn't weak, she wasn't powerless, but she also knew this was not the place to explode with anger. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes again, her calm gaze locking onto the pilot's furious face. "Are you finished?" she asked, softly. Her words cut through the noise like a blade. Passengers stirred, surprised at the quiet strength in her tone. The pilot sneered, but for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Still, his pride held him back from stepping away. The attendant folded her arms, glaring as if she had won some invisible battle. But little did they know, the woman sitting before them was not someone to be underestimated. She had built her fortune in a world where people had doubted her every step of the way. She had turned obstacles into stepping stones, insults into motivation, and failures into opportunities. Every slight she had endured had only sharpened her resolve. And now, on this plane, in front of strangers who didn't yet know her story, she would once again let her strength shine. The plane lifted into the air, engines roaring as it cut through the clouds. Around her, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers floated through the cabin. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others avoided looking at her altogether. But the billionaire sat still, her back straight, her eyes forward. She knew something. They didn't. She knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would unfold with power and precision. The pilot and the flight attendant had made a mistake that would echo far beyond this flight. For now, she waited. She waited in silence, letting their arrogance dig its own grave. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to fight them with her hands. Her revenge, when it came, would not be loud. It would be devastating. And as the plane soared higher, the passengers around her felt it too. A storm was brewing. Not in the skies outside, but within the calm and quiet strength of the woman they had underestimated. This was not just another passenger. This was not just another flight. This was the beginning of a lesson no one on that plane would ever forget. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and relentless. Yet the silence among the passengers felt heavier than the roar outside. No one quite knew how to react after what they had just witnessed. The billionaire sat still in her seat, her face calm, but her mind was sharp and alert. She could feel every glance, every whisper around her, as if the air itself carried judgment and curiosity. A young woman across the aisle leaned slightly toward her friend, whispering just loud enough for the billionaire to catch the words. "Did you see that? They actually pushed her in business class." Her friend shook his head nervously. "Don't get involved. These things can get messy." The billionaire heard them, but she didn't flinch. She had no need to defend herself. In that moment, she had long ago learned that silence, when used wisely, was the most powerful weapon. Let the world underestimate you. Let them believe you are powerless. That's when your strength surprises them the most. The flight attendant returned to her duties, but her eyes lingered on the billionaire with an expression that was part defiance, part unease. She carried herself as if she had already won some invisible war. The pilot, too, strutted with authority, his voice booming over the intercom as he welcomed passengers to their journey. But behind his words, behind the smile he forced, there was a shadow of something else. Doubt. For even he had sensed that the calmness of the woman he had insulted was not the calmness of defeat. It was the calmness of someone waiting for the right moment. The billionaire closed her eyes briefly, leaning back against her seat. Her mind wandered to the battles she had fought before, boardroom showdowns where executives twice her age dismissed her ideas until those very ideas saved their companies. Conferences where she was the only black woman in a sea of suits, where people assumed she was an assistant or a guest until she stepped onto the stage as the keynote speaker. She remembered the sting of those moments, but also the sweet satisfaction of turning doubt into respect. This, she told herself, was no different. A man seated behind her tapped the shoulder of another passenger. "I think I've seen her before," he whispered. "Isn't she?" His voice trailed off, uncertain. Recognition was beginning to stir. Not everyone knew her face, but some did. And once even one person confirmed her identity, the story of what had happened would spread like wildfire. She pulled out her phone, casually at first, as if she were scrolling through messages or reading an article. But her fingers moved with quiet purpose. With a few swift taps, she sent a secure message to her assistant on the ground. The words were simple. On board, incident occurred. Document everything. Prepare immediate response upon landing. Her assistant didn't need more details. They had worked together long enough to understand the code between them. The billionaire slipped her phone back into her lap, her face still unreadable. Around her, passengers returned to their distractions. Movies flickering on screens, earbuds, pumping music, magazines turning page by page. Yet the tension in the air remained thick, unspoken but undeniable. The attendant walked by again, this time offering drinks. She paused briefly at the billionaire's row, holding the tray just a little too far away. "Would you like something?" she asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. The billionaire met her gaze calmly. "No, thank you," she said softly. The attendant smirked and moved on, but inside her confidence was beginning to crack. There was something unnerving about the woman's composure. Most people after such humiliation would lash out or break down. But this woman? She was unmoved. Her stillness louder than any outburst could have been. 2 rows away, a passenger quietly pulled out his phone and typed a message. "Something big just happened on my flight. A woman was mistreated by the crew. She didn't even fight back. But I think she's someone important. This feels huge." Messages like that don't stay contained for long. Even mid-air, whispers of truth find ways to spread. The hours passed, slowly, the plane cutting its way through the sky. Food was served, lights dimmed, conversations hushed. But no one forgot. They stole glances at the billionaire, waiting for her to do something, say something, anything. Yet she remained serene, her posture perfect, her expression calm. Inside, though, her mind was a storm. She thought not only of herself, but of the greater picture. How many others had faced moments like this without the power to fight back? How many had been silenced, humiliated, dismissed, simply because of how they looked, where they came from, or what others assumed about them? Her silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Every second she remained composed. The weight of the pilot's and attendants' actions grew heavier. By the time this flight touched down, their mistake would no longer be a private incident. It would be a headline, a lesson. As the plane continued its journey, turbulence shook the cabin slightly. Passengers gripped their armrests, some closing their eyes. But the billionaire didn't move. She had faced storms far greater than this. The flight attendant came by once more, collecting trays, her movements sharper now, more nervous. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was unraveling. The pilot, too, lingered outside the cockpit more often than usual, stealing uneasy glances toward business class. His earlier arrogance was fading, replaced by a creeping fear he couldn't quite name. And still, the billionaire waited. 2 hours before landing, she pulled out a small leather notebook, a habit she had kept since her early days building her empire. In it, she scribbled quick notes, ideas, reminders. But today, the words she wrote were different. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not negotiable. Silence can be power. Revenge must be justice, not anger. She underlined the final sentence, her pen pressing hard against the paper. This was not about petty retaliation. This was about teaching a lesson that would echo beyond her own experience. She wanted the world to see that arrogance and prejudice had consequences, especially when directed at the wrong person. As she closed the notebook, a man sitting nearby leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I just wanted to say I saw what happened earlier, and I think the way you handled it, it was admirable." The billionaire gave him a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. Those simple words were enough to ripple through the cabin. Others who had stayed silent began to shift uncomfortably, realizing their own inaction. They had witnessed injustice and done nothing. But soon they would see that her silence had not been surrender. It had been the calm before the storm. The final hours of the flight passed in a strange tension, an anticipation that something was about to happen, though no one knew what or when. The billionaire, however, knew exactly what would come. She had set her plan in motion the moment she sent that first message to her assistant. Now it was only a matter of time. When the wheels of the plane finally touched down, the cabin erupted in relief, as it always does at the end of a long journey. But beneath that relief, there was another emotion simmering quietly among the passengers. Curiosity. They sensed that what had begun in the skies was far from over. For the billionaire, this was not the end of the story. It was only the pause before the world learned the truth. The pilot and the attendant believed they had silenced her, but they had only handed her the microphone, and as she gathered her belongings calmly, her eyes shone with determination. The silence was over. The storm was about to break. The plane taxied along the runway, its wheels screeching lightly as it slowed to a stop. Passengers around the billionaire began to shift in their seats, unbuckling seatbelts and reaching for bags in the overhead compartments. Relief filled the air, but beneath it, curiosity still lingered. Everyone remembered what had happened earlier. No one could forget the captain's humiliating words or the attendant's disrespectful shove. And no one could forget the strange, unshakable calmness of the woman who had endured it all. The billionaire remained seated, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. She didn't rush to gather her belongings. She didn't glance nervously at the flight attendant now walking briskly up the aisle. She sat still, as if waiting for something. And indeed, she was. Because while most passengers thought the incident had ended in silence, she knew it was only beginning. As the door opened and fresh air from the jet bridge spilled inside, the flight attendant forced a smile, greeting passengers as they left. But the edges of her smile twitched. Her confidence wasn't as firm as it had been hours ago. She knew deep down that she had crossed a line she couldn't erase. The pilot stood near the cockpit, arms folded, his face stiff. He too had the look of someone pretending everything was fine, even though his gut told him otherwise. One by one, passengers filed out. Some cast sympathetic glances at the billionaire, others avoided her eyes, ashamed of their own silence. A few even whispered among themselves, trying to confirm if she was truly who they thought she was. And then it happened. A man in a dark suit stepped onto the plane from the jet bridge. He was tall, confident, and carried an air of authority. His badge glinted under the cabin lights. "Excuse me," he said firmly, addressing the flight crew. "We need to have a word with the captain and the lead flight attendant immediately." The attendant's eyes widened. The pilot's face drained of color. Passengers froze, unsure of what was unfolding but sensing that something serious was at play. The man's eyes shifted to the billionaire, and for the first time since the entire incident began, a subtle smile touched her lips. She knew this man. He wasn't just some official. He was one of her company's aviation partners, someone who had been alerted the moment her assistant received her message mid-flight. She had built her empire on connections, on influence, on relationships, forged through trust and respect, and now those relationships were moving into action. The captain stammered, Is there a problem?" "Yes," the man replied, his voice steady. "There is a very big problem, and it begins with how you treated one of the most influential women in this industry." Gasps rippled through the passengers still gathering their belongings. Phones came out, cameras rolling. The whispers turned into sharp intakes of breath as realization spread. The billionaire wasn't just another business-class passenger. She was someone who carried power in her very name. The flight attendant swallowed hard. We didn't know who she was," she whispered, her voice breaking. And in that moment, the billionaire finally rose from her seat. She didn't shout. She didn't scold. She simply stood tall, her presence commanding. Attention, every head turned toward her. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said softly, but every word carried. Respect is not given because of wealth or status. It's given because every human being deserves dignity. Her words cut deeper than any outburst could have. Passengers froze, their eyes wide, some nodding in agreement. A woman in the back whispered, "She's right." The captain opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his arrogance had collapsed under the truth of her statement. The flight attendant's face turned pale, her earlier smirk now replaced with shame. The billionaire continued, her tone calm yet unshakably firm. "You thought you had power because you wore a uniform. You thought you had authority because you held a title. But true power does not come from titles. It comes from how you treat people when no one is watching. And today, you showed the world exactly who you are." The official in the suit nodded, stepping closer. "Ma'am, if you'd like, we can escort you now." But the billionaire shook her head. She wasn't done. She turned slightly, addressing the passengers who had witnessed everything. "I remained silent during this flight not because I was weak. I was silent because silence reveals truth. It showed me who would stand up and who would look away. But I promise you this, what happened here will not be forgotten, and it will not be repeated." Her voice carried like a promise, heavy with meaning, and for many passengers it felt like they had just been part of a moment that was larger than themselves. As she walked toward the door, passengers pulled out their phones, snapping photos, some even applauding quietly. Not because she was a billionaire, but because she had faced cruelty with strength, humiliation with dignity, and silence with power. The pilot tried to follow her, desperate to salvage what remained of his career. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean." But she turned her head slightly, her expression calm yet final. "Meaningless words cannot undo deliberate actions. Learn from this moment. It may be your last chance." Those words struck him harder than any punishment could have. His career, his pride, his authority. Suddenly they felt as fragile as glass. Outside the cabin, more officials waited. Some wore airline badges, others represented aviation authorities. Her assistant was there too, tablet in hand, already prepared with statements, reports, and documents. The world would hear about this. Not in anger, not in outrage, but in truth. And the truth was far more devastating than anger ever could be. By the time she walked through the terminal, whispers had turned to recognition. People pointed, cameras flashed, and within minutes, the story began its journey across the globe. News outlets would soon pick it up, headlines blazing with words like "Billionaire humiliated mid-flight" and "Airline faces crisis after mistreatment of industry leader." But for the billionaire, it wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about showing the world that dignity is not optional, that arrogance carries consequences, and that silence is never the same as surrender. She walked toward the waiting car. Her assistant leaned closer and asked softly, "Would you like me to begin the formal proceedings?" The billionaire nodded once. "Yes. But make sure the message is clear. This is not about me. This is about everyone who has ever been disrespected, dismissed, or underestimated. Let this story stand for them too." And with that, she stepped into the car, the door closing. Gently behind her, back on the plane, the pilot slumped into a seat, his hands trembling. The flight attendant buried her face in her palms. They had thought they were untouchable, that their uniforms gave them the right to demean others. But in 2 minutes, their entire world had unraveled, and all because they underestimated the wrong woman. The black car rolled away from the terminal, its tinted windows shielding the billionaire from the curious stares of travelers still buzzing about what they had seen. Inside, she sat in silence, her mind already moving several steps ahead. To the world outside, she had just endured an insult. To her, however, this was an opportunity, a chance to send a message that would echo across industries, across cultures, across every place where dignity was too often denied. Her assistant sat beside her, scrolling through incoming updates on a tablet. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the footage is already spreading. Passengers began uploading it the moment we landed. By the time you stepped into this car, it had reached thousands of views. Now, millions. The story is trending." The billionaire didn't smile. but her eyes sharpened. "Good," she said quietly. "The truth doesn't need my voice anymore. It will carry itself." She leaned back, her thoughts racing. All her life, people had mistaken her calmness for weakness. They had thought silence meant submission. But silence was a seed. When planted in the right soil, it grew into something far stronger than anger. And now, that seed was blossoming into a storm. Her phone vibrated. It was a call from the chairman of the airline's board of directors. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Good evening," she said smoothly. The chairman's voice was frantic. "We are deeply sorry. This is a misunderstanding. Please, let's resolve this quietly." "The airline's reputation," she cut him off with the precision of a blade. "Your airline allowed arrogance to fly higher than professionalism. Your staff did not make a mistake. They revealed a culture. I do not seek apologies. I seek accountability." There was silence on the line. She continued, her tone calm but unyielding. "I own shares in your company. My investments are not just numbers, they are trust. That trust has been broken. So listen carefully. By tomorrow morning, both the pilot and the flight attendant will be suspended pending full investigation. A formal statement will be issued, acknowledging not just me but the larger truth, that passengers of all backgrounds deserve dignity. Fail to act, and you will not just lose an investor, you will lose the faith of millions." The chairman stammered, "Of course. Yes, we will act immediately." She ended the call without another word. Revenge to her was not about shouting louder than her enemies. It was about ensuring they could never again stand on the ground from which they struck her. Her assistant looked at her with admiration. "You turned their insult into their downfall." The billionaire's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "Not their downfall," she corrected, "their lesson." As the car sped toward the city, her plan unfolded with precision. Within hours, press releases were drafted, statements were prepared. By dawn, every major news outlet would carry not only the story of what had happened, but also her words about respect, dignity, and equality. And yet, she was not done. She scheduled a press conference for the following afternoon. The venue chosen was no accident. It was one of the largest auditoriums in the city, a place often used for global summits and corporate announcements. This time, however, it would host something far more personal, far more powerful. The next day, the world watched as cameras flashed and reporters crowded the hall. When the billionaire stepped onto the stage, there was no extravagance in her appearance. She wore the same simple navy suit she had worn on the plane, her hair tied back, her face serene. "Yesterday," she began, her voice steady, "I experienced something that millions of people face every day. Disrespect, dismissal, judgment based on appearance, not truth. But unlike many, I had the privilege of resources, of power, of influence. And so today I stand here not only for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated as less." The room was silent. Every ear was tuned to her words. "I do not seek pity. I do not seek anger. I seek change. We must build a culture where dignity is not a luxury but a foundation, where respect is not given because of wealth or power, but because we are human." Her words carried weight. They were replayed live across networks, shared instantly on social media. Millions tuned in, not only to hear her story, but to reflect on their own. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the consequences for the crew were swift. The pilot received notice of suspension before he could even return to work. The flight attendant was escorted from the airline's offices, her protests drowned by the flood of evidence. For the first time, they realized what they had unleashed. It was not just about one woman. It was about every passenger they had ever dismissed, every person they had ever underestimated. But the billionaire's revenge did not stop there. She announced a new initiative, funded personally from her fortune, the Dignity in Flight Foundation. Its mission was simple yet powerful: to train airline staff across the globe in cultural sensitivity, respect, and human dignity. She pledged millions to ensure no one else would endure what she had. Reporters erupted with questions. Was this personal revenge disguised as philanthropy? Was she seeking to punish the airline further? Her answer silenced them all. This is not revenge. This is justice. Revenge ends with satisfaction. Justice begins with change. I do not want satisfaction. I want transformation. The applause that followed was thunderous. That night, news anchors called her speech a turning point. Social media hailed her as a symbol of strength. Hashtags with her name and her foundation trended worldwide. She had turned humiliation into a platform, insult into inspiration, silence into a movement. As she sat quietly in her office later that evening, her assistant entered with an update. Ma'am, airlines from 3 different continents have already contacted us. They want to partner with the foundation. They want to be part of the change. The billionaire looked out the window at the city skyline, her reflection blending with the lights beyond. She thought back to the moment on the plane, to the sting of the attendant's shove, the arrogance in the pilot's voice. She thought of how easy it would have been to lash out in anger. But anger fades. Justice, when done right, endures. She whispered softly, almost to herself. They thought they could break me. Instead, they built me stronger. And with that, she closed her notebook, where underlined words from the flight still stood boldly. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not negotiable. Revenge must be justice, not anger. The world now knew her truth, and more importantly, they were listening. The world did not forget. Days after the billionaire's press conference, her words still rippled across headlines, social media feeds, and conversations in homes, workplaces, and airports. Clips of her calm yet commanding speech were replayed on television with subtitles in multiple languages. Short videos of her simple line, "Respect is not optional, dignity is not negotiable," were shared millions of times. Her message had become more than a response to one incident. It had become a movement. But movements are not measured only in views or applause. They are measured in change. And the change came quickly. Airlines across the globe began announcing new policies. Mandatory training sessions were scheduled for crew members, not just in customer service, but in cultural awareness and human dignity. Industry leaders who, once dismissed such initiatives as unnecessary, suddenly found themselves speaking about a new era in passenger relations. The truth was clear. They were reacting not just to her influence, but to the undeniable wave of public demand. The IT pilot and the flight attendant at the center of it all tried to issue their own statements. They spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of mistakes made in the heat of the moment. But the world had seen the footage. The world had seen the smirks, the arrogance, the casual disrespect. No apology could erase the evidence. Their names became cautionary tales, examples of how arrogance can destroy careers in minutes. Yet the billionaire never mentioned them by name again. She had no need to. Their downfall was not her focus. Her focus was on those who had no voice. The ordinary people whose dignity was too often dismissed without anyone to defend them. Within weeks, her Dignity and Flight Foundation launched its first training program. She personally attended the opening session, not as a billionaire standing above, but as a woman sitting among the staff. She listened to their stories, to their challenges, to the pressures they faced daily. She understood that not every mistake came from malice. Some came from ignorance, some from poor leadership. You are not just attendants or pilots, she told them. You are guardians of safety, of comfort, of dignity in the skies. Every passenger who steps onto a plane carries a story you may never know, and your respect, or your lack of it, becomes part of that story. The staff applauded, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time, they felt seen not as workers following rules, but as people entrusted with something far greater. Meanwhile, passengers across the world felt a new sense of empowerment. Stories began to surface of travelers, being treated with unusual kindness and respect. Some wondered if it was genuine or simply fear of scandal, but the result was undeniable. The skies were beginning to change. The billionaire, however, remained humble. She never boasted about her role in the transformation. She simply continued her work, speaking at conferences, funding new initiatives, and quietly expanding her foundations. To her, the incident on that flight was no longer about revenge, it was about legacy. One evening, months later, she received a letter that moved her deeply. It came from a young woman who worked as a cabin crew member for a small regional airline. The letter read, "Before your story, I thought my voice didn't matter. I thought passengers would always look at me as someone beneath them, and that I had to tolerate whatever treatment came my way. But now I see myself differently. I see my role as something important, something that can bring dignity to others. Thank you for giving me pride in my work again." The billionaire folded the letter carefully and placed it in her notebook. To her, this was the true reward. Not headlines, not applause, but the quiet knowledge that lives were changing. Yet the echoes of that day stretched far beyond airlines. Corporations in other industries began examining their own cultures. Universities invited her to speak about leadership. Nonprofits reached out, eager to partner with her foundation. Everywhere she went, the message remained the same. Respect is not earned by wealth or power, but by humanity. And so, the slap that was meant to humiliate her had instead ignited a wave of dignity that touched millions. On the anniversary of the incident, a documentary aired about her journey. It chronicled not just the flight, but her early struggles, her rise to success, and her transformation of a moment of disrespect into a movement of change. Millions tuned in, inspired by her strength, her calmness, and her refusal to let anger define her. That night, she sat on her balcony overlooking the city lights. Her assistant joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Do you ever think," he asked, "about how different things might have been if you had reacted in anger that day?" She smiled faintly. "Of course. I think about it often. Anger would have satisfied me for a moment. But dignity lasts forever." They sipped their tea in silence, the night air cool and calm. Below, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the quiet reflection above. But somewhere on a flight soaring through the night sky, a passenger was being treated with kindness. Somewhere, a crew member was remembering the words she had spoken. Somewhere, dignity was being defended because one woman refused to bow to humiliation. And in that truth lay the greatest victory of all. The incident had begun as an insult, but it had ended as a story of resilience. It had ended as proof that one person, armed not with anger but with dignity, could change the course of an entire industry. Her name would be remembered, yes. But more importantly, so would her message. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not negotiable. Silence can be power, and true revenge is justice.